Hello everyone, so today we're going to be talking about 6 new-ish manga that I tried out recently. I read the first volume of each and I'm going to share my thoughts with you. Most of them I enjoyed, one of them was incredibly disappointing, so let's go ahead and jump right in. The first volume I read was my most highly anticipated one and it ended up being my favorite of this bunch, and that is The Summer Hikaru Died. This is about 2 childhood friends. One of them goes up to a trip through the forest and then comes back different, and the other character realizes that that is not the same friend that they've known most of their life. So he has to deal with that and also try to figure out what Hikaru has become. So first of all, I want to say this is definitely a horror manga, and I really loved the horror aspects in this manga. It reminds me a lot of PTSD Radio, although PTSD Radio is not linear at all. This one is definitely linear, but the imagery and the horror elements and the creepy elements were definitely similar between those two manga. I also absolutely love the atmosphere in this manga. It adds to the creepiness factor. I think small town Japan is a great setting for horror manga, and the way the paneling and the pacing and the shadows are done in this manga obviously also add to the creepy factor. This volume also introduced our 2 main characters, and they are very strong right from the get-go. You definitely feel for them right away. It's also pretty clear to me that our main character has feelings for his friend Hikaru, and that definitely makes things more complicated with the fact that Hikaru is different. There's definitely a sense of foreboding in this manga, and I can't wait to read more and see what else happens. I would also love to read more horror manga like this, so if you have any recommendations, please let me know. But yeah, definitely my favorite of the volumes I read for this video. Next is a manga that is completely different from the first one, and that is My Girlfriend's Child. I read technically 2 volumes, but I'm only going to talk about the first volume, really. This is about these 2 people on the frontier. They are in high school, they're a couple, and they have to deal with a teen pregnancy. So the first thing I want to talk about in this manga is the art. It is very simple, and there aren't very many panels on each page, but this is an art style I describe as quiet. There's not a lot of dialogue, so it relies just on the art to tell the story. Personally, I think this is the best way for me to recognize the emotions in a story, is if the art is telling the story rather than dialogue or stuff like that. So far, this manga seems pretty realistic to me. The characters react with emotions, which are not always rational, so people are making mistakes, but that seems realistic. The main characters have a really nice relationship that's built on trust and understanding, but that relationship still is tested with this new development in their lives. Also, I'm not sure if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but I prefer stories where the relationship is already established. The conflict doesn't come from the characters getting together, it comes from their relationship already settled and they have other things to figure out. So I definitely enjoyed this one a lot. As I said, I already read the second volume and I'll definitely be picking up future volumes. The next volume I read was March Comes In Like a Lion, Volume 1. This is about a professional shogi player, Rei Kiriyama. He's 17 years old, and he lives by himself, and he lives kind of a sad, lonely life until he meets these 3 sisters. So the first thing I want to say about this is I was kind of expecting it to focus more on shogi, but this is definitely more of a slice of life manga or a coming of age manga. I also feel like we were thrown into the story without any background. It almost didn't feel like a first volume. So it definitely took some time for me to get into it because of that. But also, I really struggle with the paneling of this manga. It seems to want to be this slow-paced manga, but then you have pages that are just so full of dialogue bubbles, different faces, comedy bits, serious bits. There's just so much stuff going on that it's distracting. Like when I turn the page in a manga and I see this, I don't want to read all this. It's just so much going on, and you read it. A lot of it is just throwaway comedy bits or teeny tiny moments of dialogue that don't really matter. And it just didn't make me want to read it. I wanted to put it down every time I got to a page like this, which is a lot of them. I guess I just talked about a manga with a quiet storytelling, and this feels the opposite. This feels like a loud type of storytelling, which really doesn't fit for this story in my opinion. But I did like some aspects of this volume. I definitely enjoyed when the shogi was actually focused on, especially when Rei is thinking about his opponents and what strategies they're using and what strategies he's using. Also, at the end of this volume, we get a little bit more of Rei's backstory, which got me more engaged in what was going on. There's also some animal characters in here. Some of them are just throwaway characters, but each of them has a dialogue, so they have a kind of inner voice. And I thought those parts were funny for sure. Also, at the end of this volume, we get a little bit more of Rei's backstory. That got me a little bit more engaged in what was going on, so I will definitely read the second volume, see if we get any more of that, but I was largely disappointed in this volume. If I do read the second volume and I don't like it, I'll probably just watch the anime since that is so highly acclaimed, but we'll see. The next volume I read was Don't Call It Mystery Volume 1 or Omnibus 1. This is about this guy on the front here. He's really good at deduction and reasoning. Eventually, though, he gets falsely accused of murder and he basically has to solve the mystery and prove his own innocence. So what's interesting about this manga is the author doesn't consider it a mystery, and as you're reading it, you might think, why? It seems pretty straightforward as a mystery. The only reason I can think of why this wouldn't be considered a mystery is because our main character isn't actually trying to solve anything, I don't think. He is just asking questions and information is brought up, but he's not actively trying to figure out that information, if that makes sense. He's just making observations and ends up figuring stuff out, but it doesn't seem to be his goal to solve the mystery. In terms of the actual story, I like how it's episodic but clearly linear. You have characters who return, you have plot lines that follow multiple chapters. Also, the main character is pretty interesting. I don't think I've read a character like him in a manga before. I think if you don't like the main character, you might not like the story because it is a lot just him asking questions and talking about his own life and things that he's experienced. But this was definitely a fun read. I'm looking forward to more, especially since the last chapter in this volume kind of left off on a cliffhanger. It seems we're entering a new arc with the new mystery, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading more of this. The next manga I read was the first omnibus of Homunculus. This is about our main character here. He is homeless, he lives in his car, and eventually he is propositioned to participate in a weird experiment where he's going to undergo surgery and things might happen to him. He initially refuses, but he eventually goes under the procedure and he starts to see strange things. That's all I'm going to give you for the story of this manga. The first thing I noticed when I started reading this manga is the pacing was really well done. There are no chapter breaks in here, so there's no like natural stopping point. You just keep reading, and that makes it very easy to get through the volume, even though it is a pretty chunky volume. Oftentimes when I'm reading a manga and I get to a chapter break, I feel like I need to stop or take a break myself. So to have a manga that doesn't have any chapter breaks, it just made it really readable, I guess. I also think the art is really well done. The horror elements were creepy. I do think the first half of this omnibus was a little bit stronger than the second half, and I do worry that this story could get repetitive just because the nature of what's happening. Obviously, I don't want to say too much because of spoilers, but I do think it could get repetitive, and I have heard some negative things about the story as it continues. I also think it's not the most creative story in the world. The initial premise is interesting, but what's actually going on isn't that creative. Although I did enjoy it for sure, and I like how it explores the human conscious and subconscious. But this is a good example of why I like going into manga without knowing anything about them besides just some buzzwords or genres, because I was very surprised by it and I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I'm looking forward to more. And the last volume I read for this video was the first volume of The Horizon. This is a pretty straightforward post-apocalyptic story about a boy who is by himself in the apocalypse until he meets this girl and they are trying to survive together. I want to talk about the physical release of this series first. So it was really interesting to read this because these characters are walking a lot and there's not a lot going on. So you'll have panels where the characters will walk all the way across the panel like this, or across the page. Or you'll have pages like this, where almost nothing is going on except for one character just walking. So that really made you feel the passage of time, the loneliness that happens in a post-apocalyptic setting. But because there is a lot of storytelling happening over the pages, sometimes when you have a big double page spread like that, there is some significant gutter loss, and sometimes this happens during a moment that could be emotional, so it kind of takes you out of that. Like here, you almost can't even see that there's characters in the middle of that page. But that doesn't happen too often, so it's not a huge deal, but something I wanted to mention. There's also a little bit of color used in this manga, but it's used very sparingly, so when it is used, you really feel the impact of it. This is another story that I would describe as quiet, which again really fits for a post-apocalyptic setting. And it definitely had its creepy moments as well, which obviously I enjoy, especially when the eyes are drawn. There's some really creepy eyes in here. So after I read this first volume, I went on the Webtoons app and tried to read more of the manhwa. but the digital reading experience is just not the same. It wasn't as impactful, so I just read a couple pages and decided I'll just wait until the rest of these volumes are out. It's only going to be a 3-volume series, and then I'll just read the whole thing again. I will say though that it is a very quick read, so the $20 price tag, while I understand because of the physical release of this, it is kind of a lot of money to be spending for a story that is very quick. Just something to consider if you're looking to buy this. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed this one as well. So yeah, that's all I had to talk about. Overall, I would say I enjoyed the vast majority of these volumes. It probably helps that most of them were creepy or unsettling, but again, I did enjoy some that are not that. So if you've read any of these volumes, please go ahead and leave your comments on them down below. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!